Is it true that starting today there is a so-called energy truce between Ukraine and Russia? Has Russia really agreed to it? There are reports online claiming that supposedly as of 7 a.m. today, the Russians have stopped striking our electrical substations, thermal power plants, and hydroelectric stations. But is this really the case? Because interestingly enough, this information appeared not in Ukrainian, but specifically in Russian propaganda Telegram channels. So what is this all about? The Budanov effect in Abu Dhabi. Washington's pressure, a Kremlin information operation, or simply chaos? Friends, chaos in the Russian information space. So let's try to sort all of this out right now, from rumors to, so to speak, real negotiations. But first, give this video a like and don't forget to leave a comment. It's very important for the growth of our community. All right, let's get started. We'll start with the fact that this information first appeared in the media space from the Russian side. There are several versions of the rumors about the so-called panda channels. There's a certain Belarusian security official there and some others. We won't name them all. We just don't want to give them any publicity. They claim that supposedly after the negotiations in Abu Dhabi, an oral and later a written order was given to the Russian troops. For what purpose? To prohibit strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, especially in Kyiv and the surrounding region. And this is supposedly until further notice. Some Russian public channels wrote that this directive is supposedly in effect until March 3rd, a moratorium on strikes against Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Now comes the most interesting part, friends. Some Russian Z war correspondents and other public channels are very outraged by this information. So some are spreading the news while others are outraged, saying this is a betrayal, urging not to stop these strikes and so on. And others, a third group on the contrary, deny this fact, call it a cheap fake, and claim that only one more strike remains before our energy sector completely collapses. So if Putin hits our energy sector one more time, that's it. Ukraine will completely lose its energy infrastructure. So that's their logic. We all understand that these are Russian public channels. They can't be trusted. That's absolutely clear to everyone. But it's interesting how Ukraine responded to this, because there was also a reaction in the Ukrainian media space. Before we get to that, I'd like to draw attention to something quite telling. A detail, the reaction of official Moscow. This mustachioed terrorist, the press secretary of Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Peskov, commented on this issue and said the following: "I can't comment on this yet." And this is a very telling story. Here, questions immediately arise because usually Peskov reacts differently. He either immediately denies such reports or simply ignores them, and so on. But here he says that he refuses to comment on it. Silence in such a high-profile case is quite a strong signal. Why? Because just a month ago, the Kremlin was talking about a guaranteed early peace as a priority and looked down on the proposals for this so-called energy truce. Back then, that same Peskov came out and immediately rejected the proposal from Zelensky and the Americans for an energy truce. So why is he silent now, and why doesn't he want to comment on all this? That's what is really interesting in this whole story. I'll give you the answer to this question, friends. But how did Ukraine react to all this? Our monitoring channels immediately warned that there are no official agreements. The source is said to be the Russian Z blogger Romanov, and supposedly all of this stems from him. He was like the first one. He was the one who started this whole story, and then it just took off. In Ukraine, Kraken co-founder Kostyantin Nemichev commented rather cautiously. Here's what he said: "It seems the energy truce is working on both sides. We'll see." End of quote. So he's talking about reciprocity. He believes that the energy truce is in effect. Volunteer Serhii Sternenko, for example, or other voices like Mykolaiv Zvanyok are issuing clear warnings. Look, don't fall for the bait. Even if something does happen, Russia has no intention of stopping the war. And the previous so-called truces, they violated them. So the key idea is that only a strong army can bring peace. Therefore, the Ukrainian side doesn't really see this as a sensation, but rather as an informational signal that needs to be verified. Moreover, in the government, for example, Mr. Kulima said that all services are ready for a future strike by the Russian Federation. In other words, it's unclear. Basically, it's just a question of why anyone believed this whole story. But what does Budanov have to do with this? What does Budanov have to do with this? Let's continue. To really understand the context, we need to look at where it all might have started. In Abu Dhabi, on February 1st, as you know, the first direct talks between Ukraine and Russia in a long time are supposed to take place. But even before that, 2 rounds had already been held in Abu Dhabi in the Ukraine, USA, and Russia format. This time it will be just Ukraine and Russia. The main negotiator on the Ukrainian side was the new head of the president's office, Kirill Budanov. Yes, we have a chief, Umerov, but Budanov is actually the main leader. Why is this important? Because Western media, such as Sky News, for example, write that Budanov is Ukraine's secret trump card, and supposedly he is almost the only one in the president's inner circle who is taken seriously by both the Russians and the Americans. He is not a politician. He is a pragmatist, as they write, and even the enemy respects him. It is he whom Russian sources credit with the success of this type of truce. They openly write that Budanov pressured the Russians. He pressured the Russians into this truce. That's what Russian public channels are saying. So his presence is a signal that Ukraine is negotiating based on the real situation on the battlefield. Again, we haven't heard from Budanov that this truce supposedly already exists. Yes, there is no official information about this, but I'm telling you what's happening in the information space. Besides this, friends, even before the negotiations, the Financial Times wrote that the US would propose specifically an energy truce. And maybe Russia, I don't know, listened not only to Budanov, but also to the pressure from Washington, although, again, it's not entirely clear why. Previously, the Russians rejected such proposals, but now all of a sudden they listen to Budanov, to Washington, and so on. Well, you see, there are a lot of questions. In fact, there are a lot here, but let's ask the most important one right now. If previously Russia rejected such ideas outright, what has changed now? So Petro Andreychenko, he's an expert, gives a clear explanation. He says, look, this could be beneficial for the Kremlin. First of all, because of their own problems in the occupied territories. In the temporarily occupied Zaporizhia region, there's a collapse of the energy system, he says. Civilians are left without electricity. This is a social explosion that the occupiers simply find hard to control. Secondly, there are military problems because electronic warfare systems and RF radars require stable power. Without it, they go blind, and this makes them very vulnerable. And that's exactly why they're bringing in generators en masse. Thirdly, because of Ukraine's successes, due to poor air defense during the hurricane, our drones and missiles are increasingly striking deep behind enemy lines. A ceasefire would allow them to restore power supply to their facilities. So this isn't about peace, but rather possibly about a temporary operational pause for their own survival. As Andreychenko said, we think about our people while they think about their own military interests. In other words, he explained why such an energy ceasefire could, in principle, be beneficial for Russia. But I still have certain doubts about this. Well, listen, what if all of this is just an information operation, a planted story? Let's consider the context. Zelensky's statements. Yesterday, the president warned about preparations for a new massive strike on the energy sector. It's strange that rumors about an energy ceasefire appear overnight. Secondly, this could be a way of taking the temperature, that is, testing the reaction of Russian society. Will they be outraged if negotiations begin and so on? Thirdly, it could simply be a tactical trick, an attempt to lull Ukraine into a false sense of security in order to catch it off guard when the air defense system and repair crews are less vigilant. Plus, as you know, a 30-degree frost is heading for Ukraine. Well, it would be a sin for Putin not to take advantage of this, so to speak, right? He's a maniac. Of course, he's going to keep hitting. We really do have major problems in the energy sector. That's a fact, friends. And experience shows that any agreements with Russia aren't worth anything. Well, I don't believe that this ceasefire has really been achieved. So far, I don't have, well, let's say any reasons to believe that this is actually the case. That's why, first of all, there's just an information storm in the Russian information space about this so-called energy ceasefire, which was initiated by their own sources. If it were our sources, that would be one thing, but these are Russians. They were the first to say it. Secondly, the signal, the silence from Peskov, and the context of the negotiations in Abu Dhabi suggests that something is still being discussed at some level, but it's not worth reading too much into this. Thirdly, it's about motivation, because if this is true, then the motivation of the Russian Federation is not peace, but simply a pragmatic pause to address its own needs in the occupied territories. Fourth, this also concerns their own sovereign territory, because, it's not only cold in Ukraine, but in Russia as well. There's Murmansk, Omsk, what else? The Belgorod region, there are blackouts, power lines are just falling because of the weather and so on. So in other words, they also have problems with their energy sector. Plus, our naval drones are hitting them there as well. Their tankers, they're hitting oil refineries. Fourth, this could be an information psychological operation by Russia to gauge public sentiment or gain a tactical advantage. So my key takeaway right now is this. We shouldn't delude ourselves with illusions, nor should we panic. At the moment, there are no official confirmations. If and when they appear, then we'll talk about it. Even if a pause does happen, it will be temporary and advantageous, primarily for Russia. Although, to be honest, it would also be beneficial for us because from this perspective, we all know the situation we're in. But the war goes on. That's the most important thing. Unfortunately, this won't stop the war, although a ceasefire would already be a good step and a prerequisite for this possibility. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel. Subscribe to it. Please subscribe more actively. Take care of yourselves and see you next time.